Hi, everyone. Welcome to Investor Hotseat. I'm your host, Dustin Robinson. This is where we ask the tough questions that CEOs have to be prepared to answer. Since this show is about investing, we always have our quick disclaimers. We are not soliciting investment on these shows, and we encourage you all to go to our psychedelicinvest.com homepage to review the full terms and conditions of these episodes. The agenda for each episode will be a 5-minute presentation from a CEO that will be followed by a 30 to 45-minute Q&A by myself, and then we're going to reserve about 5 to 10 minutes at the end for a Q&A. So if you have any questions whatsoever, you could just drop them in the chat box, and we'll make sure we get to them at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the CEO of Small Pharma, George. George, I'm going to pass it to you for your presentation, and then we're going to jump into the Q&A. You have 5 minutes, and you're on the clock.
Thanks, Dustin. It's great to be here in the hot seats, and thanks for the opportunity. Just before we get started, I'll draw your attention to the usual disclaimers regarding forward-looking statements. Next slide, please. So first of all, why are we here at Small Pharma? We're here because we believe that everyone deserves the option of better mental health. There are millions of people across the globe who simply put up with their struggle because existing treatments for depression and other mental health conditions don't work for them. We believe that isn't good enough, which is why we're working to develop short-acting psychedelics with supportive therapy for large areas of critical unmet need within mental health. Our strategy is focused around three key characteristics. Firstly, fast-acting and long-lasting relief. Existing studies to date have shown great potential with psychedelics in treating mental health conditions. However, all-day treatments may prove difficult to scale. So our second characteristic is scalability, where we're focused on short-acting psychedelics such as DMT because of its short duration of psychedelic experience, which means potentially less time and resource in the clinic and therefore more patients treated per day. Lastly, we're focused on accessibility, because we believe that the regulated route and reimbursable route administered by licensed practitioners gives the maximum patient reach. Next slide, please. Our current focus in mental health is on depression due to the sheer scale of the problem. It's estimated that 280 million people roughly globally suffer from depression, a number that's believed to be even larger following the pandemic. This translates to approximately $1 trillion loss of productivity to the global economy, which is why we're passionate about what we do. Next slide, please. So I'll just quickly go over our core pipeline. Our programs are structured into two target treatment profiles. The first is ultra short-acting psychedelic programs, which target a less than 30-minute psychedelic experience and are optimizing for scale. The lead program here is SPL28, which is intravenous DMT for the treatment of major depressive disorder. That's currently nearing the end of phase 2A with dosing completed in September, and we're now in the 3-month patient follow-up with results expected shortly thereafter. Our plans are also advancing well for a larger international multi-site phase 2B, which we anticipate to commence in the first half of next year. We've also initiated an SSRI drug interaction study with intravenous SPL28 to better understand whether patients can safely be administered SPL28 while continuing their current medication. Our second target treatment profile are short-acting psychedelic programs, where we're targeting a greater than 30-minute psychedelic experience, but importantly, still significantly shorter than longer-acting psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD. Our goal is to expand the therapeutic potential in depressive disorders and additional mental health indications. We currently have 3 programs in development. The first is intramuscular SPL28. The second is SPL28, which is injectable deuterated DMT. Now, both these programs have received MHRA approval recently, and we're hoping to initiate those studies soon. Finally, we have SPL029, which is our oral tryptamine series, which is still in preclinical development. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up with some key business highlights, last year we were granted the MHRA's fast track, similar to the fast track ILAP innovation passport for our lead program, SPL026 in major depressive disorder, which potentially accelerates our time to market and demonstrates regulatory support for our work. Team-wise, we have a strong team of neuroscientists and drug development experts, and we've further strengthened and grown the team this year with some key hires to support the rollout of phase 2B in our new programs that I mentioned. We pride ourselves on having a robust IP program to protect our innovations, and this year alone we secured 8 patent grants, including 2 key grants in the United States, which brings our total granted patents to 12 and over 70 applications pending. From a cash perspective, we raised 63 million Canadian dollars in 2021, and our last cash position as of our August balance sheet was around 27 million, which we believe puts us in a strong position as we lead up to our phase 2A results and our plans for next year. Thank you.
Sorry about that. To turn on my camera. Appreciate that, George. Great job presenting, and thank you for all the work that you're doing here in the industry. So as an investor, I always like to kick it off about the why the founder, got into the industry. So if you give us a little background about kind of what led you to this industry and how you ended up working with Small Pharma.
Sure, absolutely. So, what initially attracted me back to into Small Pharma back in 2015 at inception when the company was founded was its vision, which I found compelling, which was to innovate on known compounds with new data, which could potentially reduce both the time and cost in the development process while still delivering protectable candidates in areas of critical unmet need. I joined initially as a director on the board, and then the management team in 2021 when we transitioned from becoming a clinical stage, or from a preclinical to a clinical stage company, and also from a private to a publicly listed company. From 2016, the area of unmet need that we've been focused on in mental health is mental health, and currently on depression, as I mentioned earlier. Finding new solutions in mental health is a mission that's really quite personal to me, and in fact, amongst everyone at Small Pharma, they all have their own personal reasons. The impact of poor mental health on those who suffer, as well as those around them, can be really devastating. And I've experienced the impacts of depression amongst some of the people closest to me. A few years ago, a close family friend lost their battle with depression, and it's really their story and the story of many others that I've heard since working here at Small Pharma that drives me to want to find better solutions. So during the summer, I took over the position of CEO to lead us into the next stage of growth for Small Pharma, and I took over from Peter, who's the founder and innovator behind Small Pharma, and remains very close to the business now, but focused on really where his heart is, which is innovation and intellectual property.
That's great. Well, yeah, thank you for sharing your story. And before we dive into the company, I want to dig a little bit deeper on your background. Obviously, Peter, I know Peter did a great job in getting the company started, and obviously you guys raised a good chunk of money back in 2021, over 60 million. If you could give a little bit more background on yourself and kind of what you've done from a professional perspective, and what really made you guys make that transition to put you in the role of CEO.
Sure, of course. So as I mentioned, we're at a pivotal stage of growth at Small Pharma. We're anticipating our phase 2A data very soon for our lead candidate, SPL28, and we're preparing for a phase 2B and also launching some new clinical trials in the coming months. So, in that context, we've strengthened and recalibrated the leadership team to reflect this. So a key focus for me, and indeed for any biotech CEO, is to keep the business well funded for execution of those plans. And we are experiencing some very tough capital market conditions. And I bring a background in investment banking, international capital markets, and corporate strategy that I think lends itself well to the task. And I've also been at Small Pharma since the early days, as I mentioned. I know the team, the strategy and values well, and how we built it to where we are today, and now where we need to go. And as I also sort of briefly alluded to, we're supported by a team of world-class leaders in their areas of focus with decades of experience in biotech and pharma across all areas of drug development. So we have a good team to execute. Yeah,
that's great. In these capital market conditions, very important to have someone in charge that really is very familiar with capital markets. And we're going to circle back to the capital market situation towards the end of this conversation, but I want to get started with the compounds themselves. So obviously there's a selection of a lot of different psychedelic compounds. Your 2 main programs are focused on DMT. One is a deuterated version. I know you explained you guys are really focused on this short acting. So I assume that was part of your decision to go with DMT. There are some other short acting compounds like 5-MeO. If you could give a little background on why you guys selected DMT and why you're excited about it.
Yeah, sure, of course. So as I explained earlier, we began exploring psychedelic compounds in roughly about 2018 as a result really of those promising academic studies that really started to showcase the potential of psychedelics as therapeutic treatments for internalizing disorders like depression. But most of the research had focused on longer-acting psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD. And what was apparent to us, especially given the enormity of the mental health crisis, that we needed to identify novel treatments that had greater potential to scale. So that was our focus, and we prioritized exploring short-acting psychedelics, which meant, which when combined with supportive therapy, could be more, potentially conveniently delivered in health clinics, which can maximize patient reach. So, choosing the right candidate took some time and really centered upon identifying a compound where there was both sort of an existing evidence to give us reason to believe in its treatment potential, as well as freedom to operate, importantly, from an IP perspective. And so within the class of short-acting psychedelics, DMT has good supporting evidence to provide promise as a potential treatment for depression. And this is both preclinical studies, but also importantly clinical studies using imaging data that shows a similar mechanism of action to longer-acting psychedelics. And also importantly, some of the studies with ayahuasca in depression, both MDD actually and TRD, that showed some good early promise as a rapid-acting and long-lasting antidepressant. Now, of course, ayahuasca isn't DMT, but the active psychedelic within it is, and so really, that gave us a good reason to believe that it could be and it should be explored as a potential antidepressant.
And so you mentioned MDD, major depressive disorder, as your indication for your lead program. And, obviously it's a huge problem. You outlined that in your presentation. A lot of people are suffering from this condition. We've seen other companies with short-acting programs being more focused on treatment-resistant depression. If you give a little bit of background on why you guys decided to go with MDD as opposed to treatment-resistant depression.
Yeah, sure, of course. So I guess the first point to make is it's important to remember that MDD is ultimately an umbrella diagnosis that captures a very broad patient population, and indeed a heterogeneous one. TRD simply refers to the subsection of MDD patients that have failed to be adequately treated by the existing standard of care. So in that way, it's not really a diagnosis, it's just a subsection, and actually, indeed, it's a subsection that is variably defined. So in fact, I think there was a recent paper that suggested that there are more than 200 different definitions of TRD. So by focusing on MDD, we have the opportunity to explore where in the treatment journey this therapy is best placed. So as we progress through our clinical trials and further engage with payers and physicians, we'll be able to further refine our target population within MDD. And our goal is really to relieve the struggles of depression for patients as early as possible in the treatment journey. And hopefully that will allow us to treat a larger group of patients. And then hopefully that will also mean we can reduce the number of patients that ultimately become TRD patients. So in that way, I think, we're complementary with the other developments focused on TRD.
And, I'm really excited about these short duration psychedelics. So I'm watching all the companies very closely and seeing their progress. You guys, it looks like, are on pace to start your phase 2B trials with your main program in Q1 of next year, or maybe the first half of next year, which is quite advanced compared to some of the other companies. We kind of have Beckley SciTech and GH Research, maybe a little bit out ahead on that. But was wondering, obviously exciting getting to phase 2B, a lot more work after that. What does the timeline look as far as actually getting to approval? What kind of milestones do you think you'll be hitting over what time period? And if things go right, how soon do you think you could potentially have approval of your main program?
Well, thank you. We've worked hard to progress our programs and are keen to continue to maintain that momentum. We're still finalizing the phase 2B trial design, and ultimately it will also be informed by our phase 2A data. And as such, the number of patients, the exact design, how many sites will is yet to be finalized. And these are the factors that will ultimately guide the duration of that trial. But we are, hopeful that, if it initiates in the first half of next year, we could, target trial completion in 2024. Now, in terms of the second bit of your question, in terms of the timeline to market approval, well, I mean, the truthful answer is it's difficult to say at this stage. The timing and nature of trials beyond phase 2B will largely be informed by the outcome of phase 2B and the requirements for our pivotal studies as well as their final design. So, clarities on these elements will require further discussions with regulators in due course, and of course, once we have a clearer idea on that, we'll be able to give a much more clearer timeline.
Got it. And let's move to your route of delivery. So you guys, for your main program, are using IV. I know you guys are also doing some research with IM. Some of the other short-acting companies are doing injectable, but some are also doing different routes of delivery, whether it be GH with an inhalable or Beckley with a nasal route of administration. I think some of the critics with respect to, DMT or 5-MeO DMT will say that, during this experience, since it's such a profound experience, maybe you don't want to have an IV in your arm. So what would you say to those critics as far as, why you believe having an injectable form is an ideal scenario for someone receiving this type of therapy?
Sure. Well, I think the first point to start with is our rationale for the IV route. And, as you may be aware, native DMT is rapidly metabolized and not orally bioavailable. So given the active effects of DMT requires it to enter the bloodstream, and IV offers the most direct way and ensures 100% of the drug enters the circulation, so that thus, 100% bioavailability. So for our initial studies, this allows us to, much more confidently understand the relationship between dose, the level of DMT in the blood, and ultimately the outcomes in terms of safety, tolerability, and importantly efficacy. Now, to address the point on the psychedelic experience and whether a cannula can ultimately sort of not be ideal for the patient. What I can say is that from our phase 1 study, that didn't seem to be the case at all, and importantly, no subjects regretted the experience. And speaking a little bit more broadly, there is a growing acceptance by psychiatrists of IV-delivered treatments. I mean, I think as an example, in the US, as far as we're aware, there's been a growth in the number of clinics offering IV ketamine for the treatment of depression. So that's IV. Then, intramuscular injection offers potentially a greater degree of convenience to administer, and that's also a focus, as I mentioned, in our programs. This offers us the potential to provide SPL26 with a slightly different profile as well, which may offer additional benefits for certain patient populations in depression as well as other indications. So, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a phase 1 study recently approved that will give us a direct comparison between IV and IM, and between those two routes in healthy volunteers. That information should give us the ability to have a much more informed decision on the plans of both of those administration routes.
And so I want to move on to your second most advanced program, SPL28, where it's not ultra short, it's just short. So you have your first program that is less than 30 minutes. With your other program, you're looking for it to be greater than 30 minutes, but maybe less than an hour. There's kind of this big discussion among the industry about getting the right duration. Obviously, LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, could take anywhere from 6 to 12 hours. So not ideal for the clinic. DMT, 5-MeO DMT, less than 30 minutes. That's really interesting. What was it that made you guys feel like you needed to have something kind of in the middle that extended the duration? Is there some concern that maybe the ultra short duration potentially might not be as effective? And what do you think is kind of that ideal time frame that you think one of these experiments should last?
Yeah, well, I guess, I'll start by just re-emphasizing the point about the heterogeneity of the patient population we're targeting in MDD. And as I say, I think we don't anticipate there to be a sort of one-size-fits-all to offer optimal benefits for every patient. So, if you take, for example, SSRIs, there are multiple SSRIs available on prescription with slightly different profiles that offer, advantages for different groups of patients with depression. So our extended duration program really allows us to explore this by understanding therapeutic outcomes for a slightly different DMT treatment profile in both depression as well as other indications. And I think ultimately we'll be driven by the data from our trial to give us insights on the value proposition of our pipeline. I mean, it's important to emphasize we are a portfolio company and intend to develop a range of products that collectively will allow us to offer the greatest reach and benefit to our target patients. So, importantly, what does remain consistent across the pipeline that we're bringing forward therapies that are convenient to deliver.
Got it. And yeah, you mentioned, you do have multiple programs, right? You have multiple shots on goal here, and hopefully all of them work. But if one doesn't work, you have kind of backups. For SPL28, if you could talk a little bit about what the timeline looks for SPL28, your second most advanced program, and also, being that we're in this tough market, how do you plan to kind of allocate your capital between SPL26 and SPL28? We're seeing a lot of companies with, trying to really slow down their burn, and maybe companies that had 6 programs are, now staying more focused on 1 to 2. So what's your strategy? Number one, what's the timeline look like? And number 2, what's your strategy as far as prioritizing your cash burn between SPL26, 28, and some of your other programs?
Yeah, so I mean, I think firstly on the timeline of 028. So we recently announced we'd received the MHRA approval, as I mentioned earlier. That's the first in human study with 028. So I mean, that's a pretty exciting moment for us. SPL028 represents the first of our second generation psychedelic compounds to reach the clinic. We anticipate this first sort of phase 1 study to initiate in the first half of next year. And then the subsequent development strategy for 028 will be mapped out in due course. And I guess that also leads a little bit to your other question related to the cost of that program, depending obviously on the data that's generated from that trial, and as well from our broader programs. I think, for now, given our cash position that I mentioned earlier, the focus is really on getting these near-term milestones done that we've sort of identified, and then beyond that we'll be driven by data to make those types of decisions.
Okay, so let's talk about your patent strategy. You guys were founded by Peter, who happens to be an IP attorney, I know. So I know you guys have been very focused on having the right IP strategy. For SPL26, let's just start with that. I know, kind of the gold standard for patents are composition of matter. I know for SPL26, I don't believe that's what you're going for, but you do have a patent on the formulation, the injectable formulation. So could you give a little bit background on kind of why this is novel and unique such that it gets granted a patent, and how that really creates a sufficient moat to protect this for you guys?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess the overarching statement is that our patent strategy is, multi-layered. And you're right, for SPL026, that's based on a particular salt form of DMT, which is a known compound, so you can't get composition of matter protection around that. So our patent strategy around SPL026 is centered on, other forms of protection. We're innovating for the drug product in terms of formulation, as well as the synthetic route. So, you mentioned the patent we were granted, and we have, that's one granted patent. There's also 15 pending patents surrounding SPL026. So for the granted patent for 026, it's our injectable formulation, and that formulation covers the drug product, not the compound itself, and covers any form of injection, IV and IM, and indeed also covers some other psychedelic compounds. And to give you the sort of underlying invention, the key consideration in developing new medicines is stability, and that's where the novelty of our invention lies. So in the development of a stable form of injectable DMT for clinical use, which we believe represents a distinct improvement over anything that's been used in clinical studies to date. And we anticipate expanding our areas of protection over the course of our development program.
Okay, and now moving on to SPL28, which is your deuterated version of DMT. You guys do have a composition of matter patent for that one, as well as other patents. I know you guys have circled the patent strategy quite a bit. So for the deuterated version, if you could give our viewers, some of them may not even know what the word deuterated means. So what makes this novel and unique? What is deuterated? Could you tell us a little bit about this deuterated technology that you guys have?
Sure. So deuteration refers to chemically modifying a compound to replace specific hydrogen atoms with deuterium atoms. And deuterium is essentially a heavier version of hydrogen, which causes a very slight change to the chemical structure. So this structural change can affect the way the compound's metabolized and slowing down its breakdown and therefore slowing down its biological effects. So using this premise, we undertook months of screening to generate a series of potential deuterated DMT compounds to test and validate this thesis preclinically. And we've been encouraged by our preclinical work thus far, and as a result have identified what we think is the optimal deuterated candidate of DMT that may give us the extended pharmacokinetic profile that we're looking for and targeting in humans. And this has been, as you mentioned, accepted by a number of patent offices as innovative, and we've been granted to date 3 composition of matter patents surrounding O2A in Europe, the UK, and Canada.
Got it. And, I want to talk a little bit about this phase 1B trial you have on the SSRI interaction. So, a lot of people with depression are on SSRIs. So very important for us to understand kind of the interaction between SSRI and a particular psychedelic compound. And I think kind of the assumptions that people had previously is that people need to get off their SSRIs before they go through psychedelic treatment. But we have seen some studies, one by MindMed for psilocybin's interaction, that actually showed that there was no adverse negative effect of, being on an SSRI with psilocybin. So if you give us a little bit more background, whether there's ever been any research that you know of that has looked into the interaction of SSRI with DMT and kind of why this is important for you guys to figure out.
So, I guess to answer the second question first, we're not aware of any other studies, which is why we're doing it. But then, as to the why, there are many MDD patients on SSRIs, even if they're not effective in fully relieving their depression. And, taking away a patient's existing antidepressant medication can be both disruptive and unsettling for many patients. And it might not always be in their best interest, and even if the medication is not working optimally to relieve their depression. So this study is looking at interaction between SSRIs and SPL026 to help answer the question as to whether or not SPL026 with supportive therapy can be safely received by someone in a depressive episode currently on SSRIs. And we have been encouraged by the data that you mentioned from studies on the safety profile of administering SSRIs with psychedelics such as psilocybin, but we're not aware, as I said, of any studies with DMT. I guess encouraging results from our study could facilitate patient recruitment in future clinical trials, as the patients won't necessarily be required to discontinue their SSRI medication. And looking a little bit into the longer term, successful results could open up the potential to broaden patient accessibility to our treatment.
And so, just to be clear, for your current phase 2A trial on your main program, is being on SSRIs an exclusionary factor for recruiting participants for your phase 2A currently?
So a patient can come to the phase 2A trial on SSRIs, but they have to be, not working, so they have to be scoring as depressed, and then they are withdrawn from those SSRIs. So based on the right time, depending on which particular one they're on, and then they're administered SPL026.
Yeah, I can imagine that's quite a challenge getting these people off of these SSRIs for some time period before they could, join the trial. So I want to talk a little bit about the other companies that are focused on this short duration psychedelics. I've mentioned several of them throughout this conversation. We have GH Research and Beckley Psytech focusing on 5-MeO for TRD. We have Eleusis, which was just acquired by Beckley Psytech, that also has a short acting. I believe it's a psilocin, and then we also have Cybin that's doing a psilocybin analog for NDD, and I believe they also have a deuterated version of DMT for anxiety disorder. So I think the short duration psychedelics are a really, really interesting space. But one of the things I constantly think about, I try to think about what this world looks like in the future, and let's just assume all these different trials are approved and they show efficacy and safety. What does the world look like? Do you imagine that Small Pharma could have their deuterated DMT version for MDD? Cybin will have their deuterated DMT version. And like you mentioned, there's so many different patients and different patients respond differently. Do you imagine a world where there's just a large selection of various short duration psychedelic compounds, or do you think there's going to be, one or two winners that kind of, move away from the crowd? And what is Small Pharma's edge with respect to these other companies doing short duration psychedelics? That's a whole lot there, but yeah, really just want a discussion in the context of some of these other companies that are doing short duration research.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, and also you alluded to, it's fairly common to have multiple similar drugs within the same class on the market targeting similar indications. In fact, it's more the norm rather than the outlier. So while the drugs you mentioned potentially share similar characteristics of being short in duration in the context of, I guess, 5-MeO DMT and IV psilocin, they're ultimately different psychedelics with slightly different receptor profiles and binding targets in the brain. So while we have some sense of how that translates in slight differences in the acute subjective effects, i.e. the psychedelic experience, we don't have a grasp at this stage on how it's ultimately going to translate into different outcomes for patients. So whether certain patients or indications will benefit more from one class of psychedelic versus another, I mean, it's really too early to tell. We have to do the studies, but it is a very interesting area to explore over time. And just to address your question on what we believe our edge is. So I think what I'd highlight is one is our laser focus on short acting. Two, we're lean and efficient. We're still a relatively small team and focused and effective. And I think that's demonstrated that in terms of since we raised our last funding. We've delivered on all our milestones. We completed dosing in phase 2A. We're well advanced to prepare for phase 2B. We've got 3 other clinical trials initiated or close to initiating, and we're including the launch of our first Deuterated DMT program, and our patent portfolio is strong and continues to grow. As I mentioned, we've essentially tripled the number of grants, the patents since January. So I think that puts us in good stead.
Great. And you mentioned you guys are lean and efficient. So I want to kind of pivot into, the cash position of the company. You guys raised over 60 million. I believe in your last filing, your cash position is about 28 million, which is pretty strong relative to others in the industry. But I think I also saw that you guys have about a 6 million burn per quarter, which basically gives you a cash burn of about a little over a year out. So wanted to kind of understand that better, whether you expect that burn to increase, in which case, you got the cash burn will last even shorter. If you're planning to maybe decrease cash burn, are you looking potentially in the future to bring in capital? If you kind of give us a little background more on where this 28 million will take you.
Yeah, no, it was 27, and yet you're absolutely right. The cash burn's typically been sort of 5 to 6 million a quarter in recent quarters. And, that we do, as I mentioned, believe that's relatively efficient. Also when you compare it, across our peers. We're well funded, with that cash to execute on the near-term milestones that I mentioned. Now, of course, as you progress into later stage clinical trials with SPL26, and if we have promising data from our pipeline assets for them too, we would anticipate requiring additional capital to advance those programs. But I mean, clearly, late stage clinical trials are more expensive to run than earlier stage due to their size and complexity and locations across often many jurisdictions. And as such, as SPL026 advances to phase 2B, and we hope then to phase 3, it will cost more than our current earlier stage trial. So I guess to answer the question in terms of raising additional capital, I think it's really going to be our phase 2A results that will be important in determining our future plans and therefore then the timing of our funding requirements.
And so just so I'm understanding the kind of the budget you have to get through your phase 2B for your main program, would the cash you have on hand right now, is it sufficient to get you to phase 3, or would you need to raise additional capital just to get through the phase 2B?
Well, as you mentioned, if you look at that burn rate, and you think that through to 2024 to finish that trial, and the trial is a lot more expensive, obviously, and we're not we have some of our cash burn today is in preparation to that. It's not conducting the trial, so the cash is probably not going to be sufficient to take us all the way through to the end of phase 2b. But yeah.
Got it. And my last question, and then we're gonna go to the questions from the audience, which I've only seen a couple. So if anyone in the audience has any other questions, you can just drop them in the chat box. So we talked about a lot of different milestones here, but kind of want to just give you some time to give kind of an overview of like what you're excited about the next milestones in the next 6, 12, 18 months that kind of investors and others should be watching with Small Pharma.
Sure, of course. Well, I mean, the key one, and which we're very excited about, is to see our phase 2a data, and that's hopefully coming very soon. And then really it's preparing to launch phase 2b, and on the back of those results, and completing the drug interaction study, also launching these 2 IMIV comparison studies that I mentioned with 026 and 028. Those are really the key things coming up.
Very exciting. Awesome. So we're going to go to the questions. We actually just have one question so far. So if anyone has questions, drop them in. But the question is, what is the duration of the DMT treatment? And I'll actually just add on a little bit more on that. I know on your slides you talk about the plasma levels when you're taking DMT. So I think I saw that after 60 minutes, you're pretty much getting undetectable levels. So if you could kind of just walk us through the whole timing of the DMT experience, how long it takes to start, how long it lasts, and at what point, it's completely undetectable.
So the way we're currently administering SPL28, it results in a roughly sort of 20 to 30 minute psychedelic experience. So that's the dosing itself, but it's important to also understand the wraparound therapy component. So typically a patient, once they're screened, and I guess this would also be the anticipated journey for the real world, as well as what we're replicating in our trials. They would then, if they're eligible, they would then come and they have a preparation session, which is typically, depending on the patient, it can be anywhere between 15 minutes and an hour, depending on how much time the patient needs, and obviously that can be enhanced by digital tools as well, to ensure that when the patient comes, they're well prepared. Then after that, they have the dosing, and during the dosing, they don't receive any therapy. When you have a DMT experience, if it's a full breakthrough experience, it's typically all engrossing. So you go in and you're in that experience, and then you come right out. And then immediately afterwards, though, because when you come out, you come right out. We're then administering the integration therapy directly afterwards for an hour. Roughly an hour. So when you look at it all together, it's all between an hour and 3/4 and maybe 2.5 hours. Total time anticipated in the clinic.
And I think like you mentioned, you referenced the ketamine is currently being delivered through IV, and that's kind of around the time frame that you're seeing ketamine being delivered. And I think for in general, I think patients are pretty pleased with that time frame, coming in obviously before the administration, having the administration last, in the ketamine's context, about an hour. And from what I've seen, you usually hang out for about an hour or so thereafter after having ketamine. So it sounds like you guys are kind of right in the ballpark as far as the total experience time with ketamine, maybe even a little bit shorter as well. And you guys have kind of that integration you're doing on top of it. So that's fantastic. So we have no further questions. So I want to thank George for being on the show. You did an absolutely incredible job, and you survived Investor Hotseat. So appreciate you being here. And I also want to mention for our viewers, our parent company Nucleus just launched a crowdfunding. So if you are interested in what we're doing at Psychedelic Invest and are interested in investing in our parent company, you could find more information on withnucleus.com. It's withnucleus.com. George, thank you so much for being with us, and hopefully we could have you on a future episode as well.
Thank you, Dustin. Thank you.
Have a good one. Thank you. Have a good one, everyone.